with others as afterwards. So thank you very much, Dwayne. Uh, I think I forgot to mention those of you that are participating, all the participants will be muted, but you can communicate with us through the chat box. You can type in your questions for Dwayne there, and we'll try to go through those at the end of the presentation. So we look forward to your questions. So Dr. Elmore is the Extension Wildlife Specialist and the Bolenbach Chair in Wildlife Biology at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater. And he's focused his studies on the effects of fire on grassland wildlife. And as you'll see here today, he spent a lot of time focused on prairie chickens in the Great Plains. So thank you for being with us today, Dwayne. And without further ado, go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me all right, Sherry? Am I through? Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you about something that's near and dear to my heart. And I noticed that Tori Hovick is also on the line. Should have him giving part of this presentation because I'm going to talk a lot about some of the research that we just completed here at OSU. And Tori was a PhD student, and he's now faculty at North Dakota State. So I'm going to be referencing his work and a lot of other people's work. For graders, we have a little bit of data now on how they react to fire in tallgrass prairie. For lessers, there's much less information on direct impacts to lesser prairie chickens, although there are some pretty good studies that have looked at how some of the major plant communities or vegetation types that lessers occur in, how those vegetation communities respond to fire. So we can make some indirect comments about lesser prairie chickens. I'm not going to talk about Atwaters today, which is a subspecies, of course, of graders, and it was just a little too much for the time we had, but anybody out there that's interested in Atwaters, which I am too, I don't want you to feel slighted. They're very important, but prairie cordgrass is a little bit different plant community than the ones we're going to talk about today, so we'll save that for another discussion. I wanted to start off just by a little bit of history. Heath hen, so also subspecies of greater prairie chickens that is, of course, extinct, and last recorded birds were at Martha's Vineyard. And unfortunately, what happened in that situation, it was a fragmented population. It was definitely at risk of going extinct. But really, there was a lack of awareness of how fire played into the ecology of that species. And there, you can find lots of quotes if you look in the literature about the recognition that the lack of knowledge on fire relationships to this species really hastened its demise. And in that particular case, there was a large wildfire that that took out the remaining habitat for the species. Of course, the species was dependent on fire to maintain open grassland and shrublands, but they suppressed fire for a long time, built up a lot of fuels, and then there was a catastrophic wildfire that basically removed all nesting cover for 1 year, and there weren't many birds left. So really, they just did not appreciate the role that fire had for that species. And so the point of this webinar is maybe we can prevent that from happening for the prairie chickens that we still have left. I'm going to very quickly go through some general ecology about greater and lesser prairie chickens. A lot of you probably know a lot about these species, but just to make sure everybody's on the same high points, they are grassland or shrubland. And when I'm saying grassland, I'm really talking grassland and shrublands kind of together here. But grassland obligate prairie grouse, they evolved in landscapes that were mostly treeless, although historically we know 1600s graders were utilized in a lot of oak savanna, so there were some trees, but for the most part these are birds that are in treeless prairies, treeless grasslands, and they show a strong affinity to avoid vertical structure, whether that's in the form of something anthropogenic or trees. And in general, any place you find greater or lesser prairie chickens, it's large areas of native plant communities, typically greater than 75% native plant community. There's some unknown here about how much agriculture is too much, but in general, if it's less than 25% agriculture, those populations least anecdotally, appear to be somewhat stable, but I would have some question about that number, but that's generally the number that you'll see reported in literature, somewhere less than 25% conversion. So this both species lek, and leks are communal areas where males congregate and display, and then the hens do the choosing of the males because the males are all together displaying at once. These leks are typically on elevated locations where that birds can be seen and heard, and for nesting they're using perennial cover, maybe grasses, perennial grasses, or shrubs. For brood rearing, typically they favor areas that have a little bit more forb, particularly more insects. And then this comes up, do we need disturbance to create that? In tallgrass prairie, certainly without frequent disturbance, forbs are generally, at least biennial forbs are less common. When you get into more of the sandy soils in the western portions of the Great Plains where lesser prairie chickens occur, a lot of those soil types are inherently more forb rich, whether or not there's frequent disturbance or not. So that can vary somewhat. In the winter, these birds are mostly feeding on seeds, and that can be everything from acorns to ragweed, sunflower, corn, milo, whatever's available. And again, using perennial grass cover or shrub cover in the case of lesser prairie chickens. So if we look at a typical disturbance successional trajectory in the southern Great Plains, pretty much wherever you pick, whether it's New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, or even getting on up into the Midwest, parts of Missouri, Iowa, etc., if you hold back disturbance for long enough, it's going to plant succession is going to move towards a woodland or maybe even a forest if you go far enough east where there's enough precip to support a forest. But certainly it's going to end up as a woodland, woody plant dominated. And this presents a problem if you're a grassland shrubland obligate. So at the very minimum, some level of disturbance is going to be necessary at a coarse scale to prevent grassland shrublands from converting to woodland. So if you remember nothing else about this presentation, that's what I would like you to remember, because people ask all the time, well, are prairie chickens really fire dependent? Because I know the spots where that hasn't burned in 50 years and we still have prairie chickens. At some level, yes, they are fire dependent because eventually those sites will move towards woodland, which is not prairie chicken habitat. It may take a long time to get there. We may have already crossed tipping points, thresholds for some of these places, and we just haven't borne the fruit from a chicken standpoint. But we see this successional trajectory moving that way, and in some places it's already way past, and we'll look at some examples of that. At fine scales, though, how much fire do we need to create the right mix of forbs, grasses, and shrubs? This is what we don't really understand very well. Really like this figure that shows different types of potential disturbances in a grassland and has the resistance to recovery, severity of disturbance on each axis. And you see that while we worry a lot about fire and grazing, they're kind of down in this bottom left-hand corner because they're generally low severity, and these plant communities recover very rapidly from a fire, and I'm going to show you data to support that. But very rapid recovery of the plant communities in the southern Great Plains. Most all of the plants, eastern red cedar is a notable exception, but most all the plants rapidly resprout following top kill from fire or defoliation from grazing. The other end of the extreme, of course, in the top right, something like cultivation, which is a very long pathway back to some native plant community. So we kind of have these extremes here, and I just wanted to show that just so you think about fire is a very, it might be long-term impacts on the conversion to woodland or keeping an area from converting to woodland, but in the short term, as far as composition and structure, these plant communities are quite resilient and the effects are very short term. So we'll talk about graders first. Tallgrass prairie is where it occurs. Huge retraction of the historic range, mostly as a result of conversion to agriculture, or let me be specific, conversion to row crops. But Also, some woodland conversion and closing in of eastern deciduous forest. Historically, this species occurred where I grew up in Tennessee. It's hard to imagine that now. I mean, there's nothing even of a semblance of a large grassland in that part of the world anymore. So, for some of these areas, there's been no prairie chickens for a very, very long time. And where they are abundant now is primarily in the Great Plains, with some scattered pockets in the Midwest. Woody plant encroachment across most of this area is rapidly occurring, exception to this being the Flint Hills. And here's the Flint Hills, largely treeless thanks to very, very frequent prescribed fire. But most of the parts of Oklahoma and Kansas outside of the Flint Hills, and even up into Nebraska, South Dakota, we see this scenario. Woody plants encroaching in unburned prairies and fairly rapid conversion to a woodland. And this has already removed a lot of potential habitat. The nice thing is from a restoration standpoint, this is a fairly easy fix, assuming that people have the will to do it. There are situations where there's too much fire. This is kind of an exception for most of the United States, but in the Flint Hills, we have areas where most of the landscape is burned, or at least 75–80% of it is attempted to be burned every year. And so this presents some problems for nesting cover, and I'll show you some data about that in a minute. I like this old figure. It's not too old, 2002, but it kind of is making the point that in the northern portions of the kind of the core greater prairie chicken distribution or current distribution, we've seen fairly stable populations in South Dakota and Nebraska. They fluctuate, of course, with wet cycles and dry cycles. In the northern portions, primarily Flint Hills, where we now see this very large amounts of prescribed fire for livestock production purposes, seen populations drop off. Now, is this the only reason? No, there's other things going on, but there's no doubt that this annual loss of potential nesting cover has big impacts to chickens, and the data we'll look at for Oklahoma in a second will kind of bear this out. This is just some data courtesy of Nature Conservancy, Brian Obermeyer for Kansas from KDWP and our KDWPT now, but shows that kind of precipitous drop in the late 90s, and that was about the time a lot of these areas started this annual burning. Of course, there was also some weather influences that kind of were compounded there, but population really has never bounced back from that low. And Flint Hills were historically kind of the golden child, the great bastion of greater prairie chickens that were still left. Now to some more recent data. Tori Hovik, this data is actually currently in press, and if you would like to see this in print, check back in a couple months. It'll be in Rangeland Ecology and Management. Just Google Hovik Greater Prairie Chicken with REM, and you should find this. But there's a couple points here I want to make. First is tree cover. I've talked about trees already several times, and this obviously is driven by fire or the lack thereof. So we see that for nest site selection, chickens strongly avoided or minimized tree cover. So they were avoiding trees. However, on the flip side, you look at that they actually maximized time since fire. So that means they were selecting for nesting locations areas that hadn't been burned, but they were avoiding tree cover. So it's kind of the opposite sides of the coin here. Some level of fire is critical to keep grasslands, or else they would convert to woody plants, assuming the climate will support them. And certainly for greater prairie chickens, the entire distribution will support woodland. So, but if the entire landscape is burned every year and there's not suitable nesting cover, that's a problem. So it's all about scale. In this case, spatial extent. So what the problem in the Flint Hills is that most of the residual cover is burned every year. It's keeping the trees out, that's good, but nest success is going to be low. We're going to talk about Leks in just a little bit, but notice that the birds here were minimizing distance to Lek, and most of you that know anything about prairie chickens know this, that we generally buffer a couple of kilometers around known Leks sites and try to focus our management on those areas, because generally all the nesting is occurring within a 2 or 3 mile radius of those Leks. But we'll get back to that in a second. Now I want to talk about temperature. And you may think, well, what does temperature have to do with fire? Well, actually everything. So what Torrey found, and this is another publication, and I'll have all of these references at the end of the presentation if you'd like to jot them down. But when we looked at the temperature of the landscape, found that it's, first of all, highly variable, and this is tallgrass prairie for greater prairie chickens. But the chickens actually selected for nest site patches that were cooler than the rest of the landscape. So that bottom line, the one that, at least on my screen, it's kind of orangish, that's the temperature, different operative temperatures, which is kind of what an animal would feel. So it's the direct solar radiation, it's the ambient air temperature, and it's evaporative cooling. It's all of that pooled together, what you would feel if you were out in a certain position. And on the bottom axis is just air temperature. So as air temperature increases, operative temperature also increases. And we see that it's, fairly linear, predictable. But notice that the slope of the line for nest sites is shallower than the landscape as a whole. So these birds were actually in the cooler portions of the landscape, the cooler patches. And if you look at really fine scales within a patch, and I'm talking like 2-meter scale, the nests were even cooler yet. So apparently they were selecting either for temperature or some vegetation characteristic that's correlated with temperature that's cooler than what's available. So how does this matter? Well, we found that successful nests were cooler yet than unsuccessful nests. And not only were they cooler, but they were more moderate. Notice the blue line, those are the survived nests. It's a somewhat flat line compared to the failed nests. So when it was cooler temperature, like 25 C, those nests were a little warmer, and when it was really hot, like 36 C, those nests were a little cooler. In other words, they were moderate temperature. The temperature didn't fluctuate very much. And I know some of you are probably wondering, well, how do you collect data like this? It's too much to go into today, but it's all in the paper, and I'd be happy to talk at length with anyone that's interested in this type of data. But it's very interesting that we saw that nest success was actually driven by temperature at the nest site. And apparently chickens are capable of making these kind of selection cues, and it's all tied to vegetation because they're selecting for greater time since fire, which has greater screening cover and lower temperature at the patch level. But even within a patch, there's subtle characteristics that also influence temperature. So when we looked at the vegetation characteristics, and these micro 1, micro 2, and micro 3, all that means those are the micro sites around the nest. We took 3 readings around every proximity of every nest, and the only thing that differed statistically was vegetation height. That V height at the nest bowl was slightly taller vegetation, just a few centimeters, than the micro site. Of course, at the patch level, great differences between a 6-month time since fire and a 24-month time since fire. So the chickens were making selection at large scales based on time since fire and lack of tree cover, and at small scales potentially somewhat because of vegetation, but temperature is also correlated here. And is this a trivial issue? I don't think so at all, because for years and years, we've talked about the importance of vegetative cover for grouse and for quail and lots of ground nesting birds, but it's almost always taken in a predation context. And what this data shows is that actually temperature drives this as well, and it may even be more important, particularly for species like grouse that have evolved in very cold climates. I mean, we're talking about a genus that occurs at the southernmost latitude of any grouse in the world. So think about that for a second. Lesser, greater prairie chickens, and particularly outwater prairie chickens, occur at the southernmost latitude for the entire group of grouse. So temperature apparently does matter for graders, and it probably matters in lots broader ways than we even know. And this is also tied to time since fire, just as screening cover for predation. This is an example of a nest site that we're talking about. You see quite a bit of overhead cover, and it's quite a bit of litter because this site hasn't been burned for at least a couple years. Okay, I want to talk about Leks for a second. Generally, we kind of brush past Leks as far as managing for them, because we know that chickens will use just about anything for a lek. They'll lek in a road, they'll lek on an old oil and gas site, they'll lek in a burn, even in a crop field. But why we do care about leks is, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of times we'll buffer around leks and try to concentrate management in the close proximity, within 2 or 3 miles around a lek. The assumption here is that those lek locations are static, or mostly static. I mean, we know they blink in and out occasionally depending on the population size, but generally when they blink back in, their lek locations are in the same spot. That's been well documented. Most of you probably know this, that you can go to historic lek sites and have the potential to find birds again. However, what happens if we reintroduce a dynamic disturbance regime into one of these plant communities, somewhat similar to what we think historically might happen? Well, I want you to pay attention first to the nesting on the right, and we see that, as I mentioned earlier, that in our study, the nest locations, while there was a range, most of the nest locations were in the greater time since fire, the 12 months or greater, primarily the 24 months or greater. But look at lekking. See, a lot of the leks were in the recently burned areas, 0 to 11. So if I said earlier that lek locations are stable and we have these patches that are being burned in this landscape about on a 3 or 4 year rotation, then lek locations should not be favoring or in these burns, because the burns are moving. So what we actually found is when this dynamic disturbance regime was implemented, lek locations are no longer static. They move. So the stability we think of with prairie chickens may just be more a function of the stability of the landscapes, or the stability that we've tried to impose on these landscapes. But historically, lek locations might have been quite dynamic. This does matter, actually, for a couple reasons. One, it means that the birds have plasticity. They occur across broad landscapes, and they find the places in those landscapes that meet the needs and things they're looking for. It also means if we're drawing small concentric circles around lek locations and we start trying to move towards some historical equivalent of a disturbance regime, and those leks start moving around the landscape, our concentric rings might not be big enough. We might need to think much broader, because now the birds are using the landscape more broadly than what our management rings look like. So something to think about if you're trying to implement prescribed fire at a landscape level, is you may start seeing leks not be as stable as you thought they were. And I should mention, I don't have a slide for this, but this population was stable over this time. So while there was dynamic characteristics in lek locations and nest locations, the birds as a whole, the population was fairly stable and was just fluctuating based on precip from year to year. All right, there's several things going on here. We'll start with elevation on the left, and you'll note that, and this is resource selection functions of greater prairie chicken lek locations. So these are just lek locations. And you see that the birds were selecting for higher elevation. On the far right side of the spectrum, they were avoiding woody cover again. So we saw earlier they avoided woody cover for nesting. They're also avoiding woody cover for lekking. The portion of this about the fire that I really want you to focus on is this TSF times edge. This is time since fire edge. So it's a time since fire edge interaction. What does that mean? Well, I told you earlier that we saw this dynamic lek movement when fire was reapplied to this landscape, where the leks were no longer in stable locations but moved around with the fires. So they would generally, what we would find is they would, if an area, look at the right side example where the birds are in a kind of an open patch in an unburned grassland. If that patch was burned, that lek would generally shift towards the edge of the burn. So the birds would put themselves in an area adjacent to cover, but they're still in the open. So this is the kind of movement we typically saw, where the lek would move towards the edge. So there's your time since fire and edge interaction. So those of you that trap prairie chickens or work with prairie chickens, this probably isn't terribly shocking, because you know they'll generally lek near some cover that they can bail into if avian predators or a coyote or something happens to walk near the lek. But they do appreciate the open aspect of being able to be heard and seen. So this is kind of what we saw, is that yeah, they do move around in relation to fire, but there is this edge effect where they're generally shifting over towards the edge of the unburned area. So in summary of the greater prairie chicken research that we've been working on the past 4 years now, greater prairie chicken actually use all the different time since fires that are on the landscape. There's a lot of lekking going on in the recent burned. Most of the nesting was in the greater time since fires, the 2 to 3 year post fire, and the brood was kind of in between, the more transitional forb-rich patches that were 1 to 2 years post fire. But they strongly avoided, at least during the breeding season, tree cover. We did not really look at winter ecology. That's something we're working on now. They select greater prairie chicken hens selected for the greater time since fire for nesting, and nest survival increased with the greater time since fire. And that wasn't just a function of predators, but also appears that temperature at the nest site does matter, and it is related to screening cover, vegetation height, and time since fire. And leks are actually not that stable when the disturbances aren't stable, or when the landscape isn't stable. All right, switch gears. Lesser prairie chicken. A lot of you know the plight of this bird. Great reduction in historic distribution. It's currently listed under the Endangered Species Act, and occurs in several different plant communities: mixed grass prairie, sand sagebrush, and shinnery oak. I'm going to mostly talk about the latter two. Dave Hokus and several of his students are doing some great work in the mixed grass prairie and in sand sagebrush up in Kansas. And some of that is related to fire, so hopefully in very shortly they're going to have some great data on that part of the world. But I'm going to talk mostly about sand sage and shinnery oak. And these are plant communities where we don't have really very much data at all on direct response of prairie chickens to fire, but we do know a lot about how those plant communities respond to fire, and we do know a lot about how prairie chickens select for conditions within those plant communities, so we can make some indirect comments. Similar to greater prairie chickens, a lot of lesser prairie chicken historic distribution looks like this now, or actually a lot worse than this. Lots of juniper, other woody plants, but ash juniper, eastern red cedar are two of the big ones. In fact, if you look at a historic distribution map of lesser prairie chickens, you see that the big, I mean, we think a lot about eastern New Mexico and parts of Texas and northwest Oklahoma and southwest Kansas, but those are just where they still are. It's also interesting to look at where they're not, and where they're not are places like Austin. Now think about that for a second. Most of you probably are familiar with Austin. Can you imagine lesser prairie chickens in that part of the world? That hasn't been grassland in a very, very long time, and most of it's juniper woodland now. So again, fire at some level is critical to keep grasslands or shrublands open and not converted to woodland. In fact, excellent study. I would highly recommend you read it if you haven't already. Fullendorf et al. 2002 found juniper encroachment was the largest predictor of whether or not a population of lesser prairie chickens was going to be on the landscape or not. And this gets increasingly more important at larger scales. When you get out to these very large scales, like on the far right side of this figure, you see that is the big driver of whether or not a population declined or was sustained long term. And it's all back to the tree cover, which was mostly juniper. It's not all juniper, but a big chunk of it in this study was. Part of the same study, different way of looking at this data, and there's a lot of things going on here, but focusing on the center, the shrubland and the trees. And the red bars are the populations that declined, the blue are the populations that sustained over the study period. And you notice that populations that declined saw a great increase in tree cover and a great decrease in shrub cover. And what that kind of, from a GIS perspective, looked like, those landscapes where the population sustained were largely unfragmented landscapes of native plant community that were shrublands, and the populations that were declining over that period were much more fragmented with patches of tree cover and more cultivation, etc. Specifically sand sagebrush, most of you are probably familiar with this plant. It is a resprouting artemisia. Not all artemisia resprout, of course, but this one does. There's been 2 really good dissertations that have looked at fire effects on this plant community. The first was Lance Vermeire, 2002, and I'm just going to hit the high. There's a lot to these dissertations, and if you're at all interested in sand sagebrush, these should be required reading, these 2 dissertations, and a lot of publications that have come off these dissertations. But I'm going to hit the high points here relative to fire and how it might affect prairie chickens. What we see first is that very, very little mortality from fire to sand sagebrush. 96% of the shrubs survived burning, and rapid recovery to pre-burn conditions within 2 years time since fire. TSF is time since fire. 64% of the canopy volume had returned, and 80% of the height had returned. So there was a very short-lived reduction in sand sagebrush canopy and cover and height as well. And this kind of surprises a lot of folks. I remember not too many years ago, a large area of sand sagebrush burned on one of the national grasslands, and there was a lot of concern that it would be 30 or 40 years before that plant community recovered, and that's just not what the data indicates. Is that sand sagebrush is highly resilient to fire, and there is a short-term change in the forb community. You can see them in this study. There was about 60% increase in forbs, but it was only about a 1-year effect, so it was very ephemeral. Similarly, Stephen Winter in 2010, another great study. He found very similar results. By 4 years after time since fire, shrub height was back to pre-burn conditions, shrub area by 3 years. And in this study, forb and grass cover really didn't change very much with the fire. There was a little more bare ground for 2 years time since fire, and I believe he found a little bit more annuals, but it was, again, extremely short-lived for like 1 year. For those of you that have never seen a recent sand sagebrush area that's burned, this is what it looks like. This is 6 months post-fire, and of course you would expect lots of forbs, and there are quite a bit of forbs out there. You also notice a few juniper skeletons, but why I really wanted to show this image so you could visually see just how rapidly sand sagebrush resprouts, how vigorous it is following fire. You can see those scattered sagebrush plants, and again, 6 months post-fire. So a very rapid recovery, and this was not a particularly wet year either. Shinnery oak, another important clonal, this plant is clonal oak, that is a lot of prairie chickens in New Mexico and Texas, and just a few in Oklahoma occur in this plant community. Boyd and Bidwell, 2007. And this study actually was looking at prairie chicken habitat. They didn't actually measure prairie chickens per se, but they were focused on known characteristics that lesser prairie chickens were not in the literature that's shown that prairie chickens selected for. So it is a prairie chicken study, but it's indirect habitat and not actually monitoring the birds themselves. What this study found is very similar to sand sagebrush. This resprouting woody plant is extremely resilient to fire, and the shrub cover was only reduced for about 2 years following a fire. Grass cover actually decreased for the first year, and forb cover increased for the first year following fire, and grasshoppers were at higher densities, statistically higher densities for 2 years following fire. So there are differences, but again, they're fairly short-lived. And within about 3 years, the vegetation community was about back to pre-burn conditions. And this is what that site looked like. I think this picture was taken the following growing season after fire. So to summarize on the major resprouting shrubs that lesser prairie chickens occur in, there might be a temporary increase in herbaceous dominance. In some studies there were, and some there weren't. However, there's really no long-term effect on the density of shrubs. So I hear people a lot of times saying we're going to use fire to manage shrub cover for lesser prairie chickens. Know that that is a short-term effect. There's very little in literature long-term effects shown through fire as far as stem density. You can reduce cover, but it's very short-lived, 2 to 4 years, somewhere in that range. Now, might it be a little longer in eastern New Mexico where plant succession moves slower? Perhaps, although anecdotally what I've seen out there with the BLM and the New Mexico Game and Fish on some of their sites where there's been wildfires, doesn't appear that it's much different than the studies in Oklahoma and Texas. But if you're going to use fire to try to increase forb component or bare ground or some other characteristic maybe for brooding habitat, know that it's going to have to be a high frequency, and so it's going to be a fire program. It's not a once every 20-year kind of deal. Don't have data on mesquite for chickens per se, but I did want to throw this photo in because, again, I hear a lot we're going to use fire to reduce mesquite cover. Structurally, okay, for a few years, but again, mesquite vigorously resprouts, and this is 10 years after fire. So long term, if you really want to convert this away from a mesquite woodland to a grassland, fire is not probably going to get you there. You're going to have to use herbicides or some combination of methods. But in the short term, you can certainly change the structure of that mesquite plant, and that might be all that is necessary perhaps. But if we actually want to remove plants to cause mortality, that does not appear the case with the fire is going to get you there. I don't have time to really go into seasonality, but I know a lot of people think about season, and I just wanted to throw up these references to show you that there's been a lot of studies that have looked at how season might affect grassland composition structure, and really it's mostly about frequency, because seasonality has not been shown in the literature for this part of the world to really be a big driver. There are some subtle differences, but they pale in comparison to fire frequency. If those of you that work with prairie chickens, I would highly encourage you to zoom into a region-wide perspective of your area and look at Landfire. It's a USGS product. If you've never used Landfire, it's really interesting. I've zoomed in here just to kind of the part of the world where sand sagebrush is a dominant plant. The warmer colors you see on this image are actually showing vegetation departure. So the warmer the color, the more red, the higher the vegetation departure is. And if you believe Landfire, the data that goes into Landfire, this would indicate that those sand sagebrush plant communities have departed significantly from historic fire conditions. General recommendations from prairie chickens that we can see from the literature is they need large areas of native plant communities, whether that's grassland for greater prairie chickens or grassland or shrubland for lesser prairie chickens. Prescribed fire at some level is going to be necessary to keep woody plant encroachment out. Depending on where you're at, this can vary. It might be only once a decade, in parts of Texas, and it might be 3 times a decade in eastern Kansas, eastern Oklahoma, but nevertheless, it's pretty frequent. If you're going to burn those, a great portion of the area should be unburned for some period of time to accumulate fuels. So we're not talking about landscape level burns, but smaller patches so that you have these accumulated litter and accumulated vegetation height that the prairie chickens seem to select for the nesting. Forbs are important, we know, for food, both for adults and also chicks, for the insects associated with a lot of these forb communities, and we can certainly use disturbance like a fire to create that. How important is that in the sandier soils? I think that's debatable, but certainly in the more mesic sites, some level of fire definitely increases the forb component, and we have seen, at least in Oklahoma, some selection based on time since fire for those intermediate patches. And I know this is not really related to fire, but I can't get through this presentation without at least once saying anthropogenic structures and prairie grouse probably a really bad idea. And we see that trend for all grouse, actually. Torrey published recently a paper on a meta-analysis of anthropogenic structures in grouse of the world, and it's pretty clear negative trends for most species. To summarize, I'd argue that changes in fire frequency are one of the greater threats to prairie chickens. In most cases, this is too infrequent a fire, and we've already paid the bill for that in lots of Texas, for example. In some cases, like in the Flint Hills, the fire frequency is too much. But the plant communities in the southern Great Plains have been shown to be extremely resilient to fire, and that, whether we're talking about mixed grass, tall grass, sand sage, shinnery, you name it, the trend is consistent. But data on direct grouse response and fire is lacking. This is a big research need, and in the next slide I'm going to show you some folks that are working on that. So there are people that are actively trying to provide you more information on this subject. But when we're thinking of fire and prairie chickens, you should think of it as a process. It is a tool, or it can be a tool like herbicide or disking or whatever you're doing, but it's also an ecological process that has far-reaching implications to the ecosystem as a whole. And we're starting to kind of unravel and peel back that onion and see that it affects the thermal ecology of these sites. It affects the lekking ecology. It's not just about nest cover. It's more complicated than that. It affects their behavior, their distribution, the composition, structure, the insect community, everything. I apologize up front if I have left someone off this list that is doing prairie chicken and fire research. I know there are some great research projects going on at Texas Tech and other places looking at greater and lesser prairie chickens, but I put the ones up here that I knew of that are actually looking at fire specific. So if I forgot somebody, please let me know. Ashley Unger here at OSU is working on lesser prairie chickens, primarily anthropogenic issues, but also some fire work. Heath Starnes is actually looking at greater, lesser, and Atwaters, and this is a joint fire science funded project. Dave Hokus has some work going on in Kansas that should get more at the juniper issue for lesser prairie chickens. And Scott Carlton, hopefully in a couple years, will have some data relative to mesquite fire and lesser prairie chickens. And I've given you a lot of citations throughout this presentation, and I think I have actually put them all here. So if we're able to have questions that, but if we are, you're welcome to jot these down. And if you don't have access to some of these, if you're not in a place where you can get these by PDF, if you'll just email me, I'd be glad to send them to you. Sherry?
Thanks very much, Dwayne. That was a great presentation. If you wouldn't mind, Dwayne, just typing your email address in the chat box, so if people want to communicate with you directly, they can do that.
Sure.
And then, before we go ahead and take questions, we already have a couple. I'll just remind those of you that are interested in continuing education credits, make sure that you email me at gpfirescience@missouristate.edu, and I'll get you the forms to take care of that. So, Dwayne, we have a couple questions. The first,
I see them.
any data on the role of nest bowl temperatures at more northern latitudes?
That's a great question. That's something Tori and Sam and I have talked about a lot. You know, how important this be at more northern latitudes. There is no data on that, and you know, so anything I'm saying is just purely speculation. So take it for a grain of salt. But I would suspect it's equally as important. I mean, because even in the Dakotas, you can see extremely high temperature events and high solar radiation readings. It might not be as prolonged. You might not have these long stretches of 115 degrees for long periods of time. But what we saw with graders is they apparently were pretty selective at subtle differences in temperature, and it may be even lower temperature than you would expect them to start showing selection. We're seeing that with quail, incidentally, by the way, too. And with quail selection, I mean, they're starting to go to refugia, cool refugia at 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, that's not very hot. So And quail evolved in warm climates, and grouse did not. So I would expect grouse to be even more sensitive. So while we don't have data at northern latitudes, my hypothesis would be you'd find the exact same effects. The second question is fire's main benefit keeping large woody plants out, in other words, keeping it open in grassland. That's correct. But some level of fire might be necessary for diversity and create large bare open areas for lekking. That's mostly correct, I think. As far as the lek, I'm not implying that we need to be managing for leks. I think chickens are very plastic in what they'll choose to lek in, and I don't think there's any data to indicate that lek sites are limiting. What we are showing is that leks become or dynamic when disturbance regimes are dynamic. But as far as diversity, as far as burning for plant diversity or forb diversity, yes, there is data to indicate, for greater prairie chickens at least, that using fire does cause brood locations to kind of more fall into those intermediate patches. Now we still have brooding activity in the same areas that the hens are nesting, but there's some unpublished data that shows that the birds that get their broods into those intermediate time since fire appear to have higher brood survival than the hens that did not get their broods to that intermediate time since fire. So there probably are some benefits in the short term as well. Anything else?
Lisa asked towards the end, you were using a
Mm.
term probably anthropogenic. Could you define
Yeah,
that?
anthropogenic. So any structures that humans are putting on the landscape, so it could be houses, power lines, roads, oil and gas wells. Some of this we have better data than others. For instance, wind turbine data is pretty lacking. Brent Sandercock and his group did a study in the Flint Hills on wind turbines and greater prairie chickens, and that's about all we have. But we have quite a bit of published studies for lots of grouse species on oil and gas, and it's pretty much overwhelmingly negative. Although the Sandercock study did not show a whole lot of negative effects on the wind turbine side, so it's probably site specific and not always is it going to be a negative response. But the meta-analysis did show overwhelming negative behavioral and survival implications from these human place structures on these treeless prairies.
Dwayne,
Anything else?
while
Yep, sure.
while folks are thinking about more questions, I just wanted to ask, there's some efforts to restore prairie chickens where they're trying to establish leks in places where there may have been some historical leks. What you're finding about plasticity in terms of lekking, how should folks who are working on restoration incorporate that?
I think the the biggest concern for me is that we make our management concern too small. So if we put chickens into an area and they start lekking, and we draw a circle around it and say, well, most of the next locations in the literature are 2 kilometers from a lek, so we need to make sure that 2 kilometers around a lek is good habitat, and everything else, not worry about it. And I'm not saying that that's what folks are doing in these areas, but I know as you get increasingly larger scales, it's harder to manage, and you might not even have control over these areas. There's a mix of ownerships, but for what we see is that these species occur across broad landscapes, and that lek locations might be more stable when we're not implementing a fire program, but uh, we see that these species have the capacity to move across large landscapes. They use large landscapes, and the more area that you can have as suitable cover, the better. So I think rather than micromanaging small scales, we should just be getting it approximately right at large scales. I'd much rather have marginal grass composition and structure at 10,000 hectares, optimal at 1,000 hectares.
Great, thanks.
Okay.
It looks like so we got two
Um,
more questions. The minimum size for lekking is the first one.
Okay, do you mean minimum area that would support a population or a lek, or do you mean the minimum area of openness that birds would lek on? Okay, so the latter. Um, yeah, I don't know. I've never really thought about it like that. I mean, we've seen pretty dense grass patches where there's just kind of a tiny little opening, or maybe not even much of an opening at all, that has a few birds on it. But it seems like generally the larger leks, with 8 birds or more, you're talking about an area across that's, maybe 20, 30, 40 meters across. Um, but I don't think, to my knowledge, no one's ever really looked at characteristics at that fine of a scale to be able to see if it's actually correlated with whether those birds will stay on a particular lek spot or not. So I don't really have a good answer for that question. Sorry. Second question was, what kind of density-dependent feedbacks would you expect are primarily regulating population size? Hmm. Yeah, I have to give that some thought. So, well, we could probably talk a long time about that. There's certainly probably some things going on with minimum number of males that are attending some of these leks as far as a lek persistence, but that's really more of a function of the total population size and how much recruitment there's been, because you'll see these time lag effects for lots of grouse. I mean, sage grouse have shown this too, where a population gets down to very low levels, but leks will persist for quite some time. But there really is no more recruitment going in. But I don't know that any of these populations that I'm familiar with are at large enough capacity that I would expect there's any kind of density dependence going on as far as limiting them. I mean, probably most of these areas could support a lot more birds than are currently on the site, and a lot of that's probably having to do with low recruitment. In the Flint Hills, for example, low nest success because there's just not a lot of cover. Although from Tori's work, we also saw that the birds may be potentially abandoning nests when it gets really warm. But so there's probably lots of climate constraints and habitat quality constraints, but I don't know that any of these populations are really at high density. I wouldn't expect that there are food limiting, for example. It's probably more cover limiting. I'm not sure I really addressed your question in full, but I have to give that. It's a good question.
Like we've got one more person trying to ask
Mm-hmm.
a question. Neil's
Oh,
asking
very good.
applicant in regards to egg hatchability. Are there any measures of relative humidity?
We did not collect that data. There is some work on lesser prairie chickens that's been done, and I think still being done, that's looked at relative humidity, and I think there's some work being done on scaled quail that's looking at relative humidity. So stay tuned. There are other people focusing in on this topic and trying to get a better handle on how temperature, relative humidity, and other microclimatic um, variables might matter. But right now we have a very superficial understanding of this. I will say though, on the temperature side, the few studies that have been done are very consistent, whether it's scaled quail, bobwhite, greater prairie chicken, or lesser prairie chicken. All of these species are showing sensitivity and selectivity to temperature.
Dwayne, can you talk about on the vegetation side? I know that the classics model of post-burn recovery is about that intermediate stage that's really 4B. But I'm wondering, have in the studies that you were talking about and have been involved with, have they actually measured that increase in forbs? And is that cover that you're talking about?
Yeah, most of the studies have, and it's somewhat variable. And I, I neglected to say this earlier, and I'm glad you asked that question because it's not that 4B or that intermediate stage is a function of several things. It's obviously a function of how much precipitation following the fire. It's a function of soil characteristics primarily. Is it, coarse sandy soils or fine textured soils? But it's also a function of other disturbances. In other words, if you go to the tallgrass prairie and you burn a patch and exclude cattle from half of it, it's going to look completely different than the grazed area. So, in the absence of the grazing following fire, there is almost hardly any intermediate patch. I mean, it quickly goes back to pre-burn, at least vegetation height characteristics. Now, litter will take some time for plants to break down and accumulate that litter layer that is important for ground nesting birds like greater prairie chickens and Henslow sparrow. But from just a vegetation height standpoint, I just saw this year at the tallgrass prairie, an area that didn't get grazed, and I would have sworn it was 3 years time since fire, and it had been burned 6 months prior, but there had been no livestock on it. Just across the fence where livestock had access all during the season, and at moderate stocking density, not high stocking rate, it was very 4B. So it's also a function of that grazing fire interaction that a lot of you've probably heard a lot about. I didn't go into that. It dictates the forward response. Okay, there's another question. In regards to temperatures, have you found that certain direction of slope facing is preferred for nesting? I'm trying to remember back if we evaluated slope in the Greater Prairie Chicken study. Tori's probably wanting to jump in here. I think Tori did look at slope, and I don't think that it mattered. And
Not really, because other parameters were so much more influential.
oh, thanks, Tori. There you go. There's your answer. And that landscape, just FYI, it actually did have some topography. I mean, it's not completely flat. It's not dramatic escarpments, but there's a fair amount of topography out there.
I think we're nearing the end of our time, and so I appreciate all of you hanging with us through the question period. And again, Dwayne had his email up there for you if you need to contact him. And we'll try to get this list of references in when we post the recording of this webinar. We'll try to put that references as a standalone document with it, so you don't have to worry if you didn't get them all scratched down. So I thank you very much and have a good